The war in Afghanistan now in its 16th year. The US president is considering sending in several thousand more troops. Donald Trump also wants NATO countries to do more to help in the fight against terrorism. But some in Afghanistan say an increase in foreign forces is like adding wood to a fire. This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Jane Dutton. You're watching Inside Story. Good to have you with us. All eyes were on Donald Trump as the US president arrived in Brussels for his first NATO summit. Trump's been critical of the military alliance in the past during his election campaign. He called the organization obsolete. But now the president is urging NATO members to increase their defense budgets and pay their fair share in fighting terrorism. While international leaders are discussing bolstering NATO's presence in Afghanistan, many people in Kabul don't want to see more foreign troops. We'll go to our guests in a minute, but first, this report from John Hendren in the Afghan capital.
The prospect for a troop surge for Afghanistan that's drawn considerable support in Brussels and Washington faces opposition from a corner NATO ministers might find surprising: Kabul.
An increase of foreign troops would not help. They should decrease them, because in the past 14 years, the presence of foreign forces in Afghanistan has not brought any change on security in this country.
Sher Mohammad Karimi is a retired four-star general in the Afghan National Army, trained in the UK and in the US. He counts top American commanders among his friends.
Now they're thinking about sending soldiers, 5,000 soldiers. They will not do anything. If they are advisors, then it's okay. They can train the ANA. But the question is, ANA needs as good equipment as the international forces had here in Afghanistan.
So in other words, keep your troops, give us the equipment, maybe some trainers.
Yes.
A spokesman for the Afghan Defense Ministry agrees.
What we need for now is bombing planes and also modern engineering technology that's needed here. And it should be very, very cutting edge. That's what we need.
U.S. President Donald Trump's administration hopes a modest increase in U.S. and NATO troops would put enough pressure on the Taliban to bring it to the negotiating table and end the war. Some Afghan military commanders agree. But many Afghans recall how the surge of 30,000 extra troops from 2010 to 2012 failed to alter the course of the war.
Afghanistan has been called the graveyard of empires. This monument commemorates the victory over the British, but Genghis Khan, Alexander the Great, the Soviets, and the Americans all had little trouble getting into Afghanistan. It's been getting out that has been the problem, and historically speaking, adding more troops has rarely been the answer. Many Afghans we spoke to say they fear additional foreign forces could actually prolong the war.
Increasing foreign troops in Afghanistan is like putting more wood on the fire. If they bring in more troops, that would provoke Pakistan, Iran, and Russia. Neighboring countries would increase their support for the Taliban, and more Afghans will be fighting each other.
With or without a new troop surge, after 16 years of war, U.S., NATO, and Afghan leaders all seem to agree that the end will come not on the battlefield, but at the bargaining table.
Joining me now are our guests in Brussels, Kristine Berzina, Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Kristine is also an analyst on US-EU relations and NATO in London. Heather Barr, senior researcher and a former Human Rights Watch Afghanistan researcher. And in Kabul, Faiz Mohammed Zaland, lecturer of political sciences at Kabul University. Welcome to all of you. Very good to have you with us on Inside Story. Faiz Mohammed Zaland, here we go again. Should we be sending in more troops? Is it a good idea?
I don't think so. Let's have an historical background for the surge of coalition forces. Let's not forget that Mr. Obama in 2009, he had a bigger surge of in numbers of the NATO forces and also US forces. But the result was 2010-11, the casualties not only within the coalition forces, but also with the civil casualties. The war increased and the destruction comes further. It has also created problems for peace dealings and the reconciliation processes within the country. I think once again, if there is a surge, and the surge means that there will be more war, the NATO and US-led war will go after 16 years I think the country, Afghanistan, and its current political condition, situation, social and economical, does not come with any kind of more trouble to the country. The biggest problem within the war is the corruption in the defense and also interior ministries. As Mr. President Ashraf Ghani mentioned in his last speech, that the biggest ministry within his cabinet is the corruptest ministry within his cabinet is the Interior Ministry and Defense Ministry. So if the surge comes, I think it cannot solve the corruption problem, the incompetency problem, and also the fight on terror. The main problem within the war in Afghanistan is money, arms, and the safe havens.
Berzina, you also heard from people there in Kabul saying it doesn't work, it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Where do you sit in this?
I sit in Brussels, where we have the NATO view, and I have one ear on the ground as well in Washington. And I would say that it isn't clear from any of the NATO allies, whether in Europe or in the United States, that more troops are unequivocally the best choice. Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, said in a press conference that the kind of troops that they are considering sending and would like to contribute are troops for capacity building and training, specifically to support special operations forces as well as the Air Force. So what we just heard in terms of needing training support, that is something that NATO is thinking of as well. The big fear in Washington and in Europe is for some kind of combat escalation. There is not much appetite, given the range of threats that the NATO allies face currently, to get bogged down into another major combat operation. But providing support is very important.
Heather Barr, with your experience on the ground as a researcher and seeing this sort of impact, the fallout of troops and when it does work and when it doesn't, what do you think about this latest gesture?
Well, I think we have to ask some very hard questions about not what will be done, but how it will be done, and what attention there will actually be to the impact that the presence of the existing troops and any additional troops will have on the lives of Afghans, particularly in terms of civilian casualties. The United Nations has been tracking the number of civilian casualties every year since 2008, and that number's gone up every year since 2008. And one particularly alarming thing that we saw last year was actually a doubling in the number of people killed or injured by airstrikes. And airstrikes, that's pro-government forces. It's Afghan Air Force and it's NATO forces. So we have to ask what's happening with the targeting and the choices that are being made in the use of that air power that's leading to so much devastation on the ground. And we have to remember that civilian casualties, they drive internal displacement, they drive people fleeing the country, and they also drive support for the Taliban. So, you know, there are ways that you can intervene that are pretty counterproductive.
Okay, I want to talk about that topic a little bit more later on and the devastating impact on the civilian population. But let's take a closer look now at NATO's operation as it stands in Afghanistan. So it puts it into perspective. There are 39 nations contributing more than 13,000 troops to train and assist Afghan forces. NATO ended its combat mission in Afghanistan in 2014. The majority of those troops, more than 7,000, are from the US, Italy, and Germany sent about 1,000 troops each. Due to an increased threat by the Taliban and other armed groups, the US now wants NATO countries to send up to 5,000 more troops. Kristine, let's talk about the number, the 5,000. I mean, what can 5,000 really do? We've had hundreds of thousands in the past. We've had surges that Faiz was touching on a little bit earlier on. So what really can they do? What's the point?
The point for more troops seems to stopgap some of these critical areas to really support the fledgling Air Force in its efforts to be more self-sufficient and to become better. And this very targeted special operations forces as well. The Taliban is one issue at hand, but also the rise of the local Islamic State groupings as well is a major concern. So when NATO looks at its efforts in Afghanistan, they are looking specifically at these counterterrorism threats. That is in particular what allies will also be focusing on. The meeting in Brussels today is all about the way that NATO is going to address terrorism around the globe. Afghanistan is one part of that, and it is the oldest and most consistent commitment that NATO has. But there are new areas that require ever more attention among all of the allies, looking at Syria and looking at Libya as well. So these are things that are on the minds of all the policymakers here today as they decide where troop commitments should go. You are correct that 5,000 isn't a tremendous number, but when all of the allies already feel stretched thin, given all the threats they have to address, this isn't a done deal. And when you look at the debate about it, even in the United States, when you look at the 13,000 troops that are currently in Afghanistan from NATO's side, 8,400 or so of those are American. So there's a question when there is such a high proportion of American troops involved, what will more American troops do? Is there a need for additional troops as well?
Okay, I'm just going to jump in quickly and ask you about those numbers.
Yeah,
I mean, you know, Donald Trump is asking countries to give more towards the coffers, including people, men on the ground, to do whatever it is that they're going to end up doing. And you've got countries like Luxembourg putting forward one person, Greece just a couple more. How is that fair? And what difference really can so few people make?
I think it's a very good question. It is the question on the minds of so many policymakers. There is fatigue on this issue and a question of where the best resources should go and how they go. So absolutely, I think that the questions that are being asked in Washington, in the Allies, and in Afghanistan itself, these are valid, which is why we don't have a straight answer in advance of this NATO meeting about what the troops will be and where they'll go, exactly what their purpose is, except to reassure all of the allies that these will not be combat troops. So again, the reservation that comes with this discussion is indicative of the fact that it isn't a massive operation that anyone is considering, but it instead is a targeted support approach for this ongoing effort to fight terrorism in particular.
Okay, resources, which you raised, Heather Barr. I mean, that's one of the problems in Afghanistan, isn't it? Where the resources actually go and the resources that are put forward for military endeavor end up in the wrong hands.
Well, corruption is clearly a serious challenge, and foreigners have contributed to the high level of corruption that we see in Afghanistan through the ways that they've spent money in ways that have been unaccountable. And it's not just an issue of corruption, it's also an issue of funding bad actors in Afghanistan. We have an excellent example of that quite recently, where the UN Committee Against Torture has come back with findings on Afghanistan, where they've specifically discussed a commander named General Abdul Razik, who's the head of police in Kandahar province, who they said has been linked with running private prisons, with arbitrary killings, with torture. This is a key ally for the NATO forces. So we have to ask some real questions about, are the resources actually not only facilitating corruption or being lost, but also facilitating harm to civilians?
Faiz, do you get the feeling that sometimes NATO considers it worth it, this money possibly ending up in the wrong hands because it's helping them fight the insurgency?
Yeah, corruption, I think there are so many surveys, especially the survey of Asia Foundation. If you go through that, it shows that the first cause of the current insecurity and bad governance and also what's going on in Afghanistan is the first cause is considered corruption. Incompetency within the government. There is no trust on the commanding positions or commanders of the war. They sell their shells to the insurgents. They sell their fuel, gas to the insurgents. They leave, even they sell their checkpoints. You must have noticed that in 1 year, twice Kunduz was in the hand of Taliban. It collapsed into the hands of Taliban. The commanders within the military, not only they are incompetent, but they are also somehow not thinking of the national interests. They have more ethnicized, politicized the military sector. So this politicization and ethnicization of the military sector has created a lot of problem within the security ministries of the country, and it has increased the war. It has increased the level of the land control over Taliban. Taliban in 2017 controls more than 50% of the land geography of Afghanistan. So it really has caused trouble. I think the surge will not only solve this problem, but it will also double that problem, because more money will come, more ammunition will come, and it will give more land to the war and insecurity. The opposition or the Taliban or the insurgency will come with a response to that. And that response will not only create casualties within the sector of the security, but it will also cause civil casualties, which cannot be tolerated by Afghans.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about the players on the ground, and there are many parties involved in this war in Afghanistan. Let's see who controls what. A recent report says the Taliban controls 19 out of approximately 400 governing districts. An estimated 2.5 million people live in those areas. More than a quarter of Afghanistan remains in contested areas where 9.2 million people, or nearly a third of the population, live. The Afghan government controls less than 60% of the country, according to the US military. And then there's the ISIL offshoot in Afghanistan, Islamic State Khorasan, also known as ISIL-K. They're based in the eastern province of Nangarhar. The group has been targeting civilians, recruiting fighters, and expanding its influence in the region. How are you seeing this playing out on the ground, Heather? The tussle for support from Afghans themselves. I mean, who's winning here? Taliban?
I mean, it really varies from one place to the next. And I mean, the last couple of trips that I've made to Afghanistan, I've been focused on looking at girls' education. So talking mostly with families and girls about whether they went to school, and if not, why not. And some of the most interesting interviews I did were with women who were from Nangarhar province and who were describing how their experience had changed as the areas that they lived in had shifted from being controlled by the Taliban to being controlled by ISIS, and how it's strange to say, but the Taliban were comparably benign. But I think it's a mistake to focus too much on ISIS. I mean, people have written some important things worth listening to about how the focus on ISIS risks sort of forgetting the fact that for most Afghans, the biggest threat, the problems they're facing in their day-to-day life are because of the Taliban or because of the conflict between the government and the Taliban, not ISIS. But I think that, you know, people are just really struggling to live their lives. And you see that in regard to education, you see that in regard to healthcare, you see that in regard to freedom of movement, people's ability to earn a living. And on all of those fronts, things are getting worse. We know at the moment, for example, that about 1 out of every 16 schools in the country is now closed down because of security reasons. And we also are seeing an alarming increase in schools being occupied by the Afghan army and used as fighting bases rather than being available to educate children.
Yeah, so the knock-on effect is extraordinary, obviously. I mean, so for this very reason, NATO also predicting that it's going to get worse, also from intelligence services, are trying to put together a formula to make it work. And this is what the NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg had to say.
All 28 allies are members of the global coalition. And today we will agree on NATO's membership in the coalition. This will send a strong political message of NATO's commitment to the fight against terrorism, and also improve our coordination within the coalition. but it does not mean that NATO will engage in combat operations.
Okay, so Kristine, he's confirming again there that they won't get engaged in NATO engagements. So you really wonder how they are going to make profound change and who they're going to be playing with to make it work. And who I'm referring to here is Russia. Do you think Russia will become a bigger player in all of this?
Russia is on the minds of leaders in Brussels when thinking about the situation in Afghanistan because of reports that Russia is supporting the Taliban in various ways. So as NATO weighs its role in Afghanistan and an increased presence, even if it's non-combat, that is taken in light also of Russia's role in the region. Russia is a major concern for the alliance at the moment within Europe itself. And the appetite to entangle the alliance with Russia is very limited. I think a steadfast approach in the East and a less confrontational approach in Afghanistan would be preferable. Therefore, it is something that is worth considering here. We heard that it's really important to make the systems better, to allow the Afghan army to be more effective, to be smarter in its behaviors. That is the kind of support that NATO is interested in providing. It is this modern control mechanisms that are lacking, that could be improved, that is something that NATO could help along on the ground, because it is a balancing act between the geopolitical interests and the local interests.
Okay, let's talk about the local interest phase. What do you think the Afghan leadership would like to do when it comes to, firstly, dealing with Russia, who they're becoming closer to, and also how do they deal with NATO, and how do they trust Donald Trump, who has raised doubt as far as security is concerned, considering that he's possibly leaked security detail? So where does the trust come in here? How does it work?
Yeah, the biggest challenge for NATO, US is not having a committed partner in Afghanistan, a partner which can win the war, which can win the mind and heart of people, of its own people, work with the geographia, work with the regional powers, and finally create not only Afghan-owned, Afghan-led peace or reconciliation process, but also can win the war on terror. That's one problem. Second is the incompetency within this partnership. It really has not worked with the beginning of National Unity Government, NUG, which is having a lot of problem with it itself. Dr. Ghani and Dr. Abdullah, they don't go together. They have problems. They are having a blame game within their own government, within the presidential palace. Third is the Taliban's regional political strategy. Taliban have been more powerful and stronger in playing a regional role than in National Unity Government. Their office in Qatar is having a stronger relationship with Iran and Russia, China, than the Afghan government itself in the region. We have been noticing that Moscow conference, for the 5th time, they have been creating a regional integration to have a solution for the Afghan peace or the Afghan current insecurity. But the National Unity Government recently they have been calling for Kabul process. They believe that this process will lead a solution and will create a regional consensus on Afghan security. But I'm not very happy about that. I don't think so that it will really work because in the region there are problems with the increased strengthness of ISIS, with the drug trafficking and drug cultivation. 2017 will have a more than 10% increase in the drug cultivation and also drug production. So all these problems within the government, I think, will give a message to the region that they should create their own regional consensus or solution for the Afghan peace.
Okay, so a lot of debate, therefore, whether 5,000 more troops is going to aid or hinder progress in Afghanistan. Thank you very much to our guests. Kristine Berzina, Heather Barr and Faiz Mohammed. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. Mine's @Jane Dutton. From me and the rest of the team, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.